A man once said, "Better the illusions that exalt us than 1,000 truths." The thing about illusions, which our good friend Alexander Pushkin appears to have forgotten, is that they must be carefully maintained, not unlike a house of cards. A single push, or perhaps a hand just slow enough to catch the eye's notice, can bring it all crashing down. What then becomes of our exalting illusions? Might then the false heaven become a true hell? "No," Monster barked.
Why not?
Elizabeth protested.
It's a useful skill, and we have plenty of time to kill.
"I'm inclined to agree with Mr. Marsh on this one," Peter Dane, the brilliantly inventive rat, added. "A round of fisticuffs is no place for a lady." The scale, a sail-powered vehicle built from the steel frame of a roller skate, was at that moment embedded in the side of a grassy hill. Upon its first test run, the sail had proven insufficient to carry the weight of its occupants, and the addition of Monster's giant halberd. Given a few days to tinker, Peter then rigged up a larger sail, shaped not unlike an inverse, obtuse, isosceles triangle. In other words, he made it wider. As you can see, the result was a success beyond Peter's wildest dreams. With the first gust of wind, the scale not only surged into motion, but even lifted off the ground and went sailing into the wild blue yonder, not unlike a tiny hang glider.
"Are you sure you wouldn't prefer my help with the scale?"
the giant hairless mouths asked Peter, desperate to change the subject. No, Peter answered. "I just need Stu to dig it out a bit."
"Y'all hear that, Baldy?"
The shrew's grinning face poked out of the soil.
"It needs me more than you."
Hush!
Elizabeth scolded.
Just dig.
"Your wish is my command,"
Stu answered, blowing the attractive, by rodent standards, little mouse a kiss. Elizabeth smirked at the gesture, and then turned back to Monster.
Well?
"Out of the question,"
Monster growled.
"I am more than capable of defending you."
And what if you're not around? Say there's more coming at you than you can deal with.
Monster shook his head.
"You have my word, Elizabeth Hartley. I will always be around, and there is no mouse or rat that can overcome me."
At this, Stu poked his head out of his hole.
"What about Nicky the Towel and Bill from the Bilge?" "I would have subdued William Dawson if another rat hadn't thrown a tomato in your face."
Stu cut him off. Peter gave the scale's back end another tug.
"Regardless, there are worse things to contend with than mice and rats."
"Uh-huh," a tiny voice agreed, as Matrix, a jumping spider, crawled up Peter's shoulder.
"Of more immediate concern, however, is the scale," Peter concluded.
Glancing to his shoulder, he asked,
"Have you secured it?"
Matrix shook his head and motioned to the hillside.
"Yes, I see. There isn't much in the way of places to tie it off."
Monster scoffed.
"I honed my skills against tarantulas and centipedes,"
Don't forget the trapdoor spiders.
Elizabeth added.
"and I personally stood toe-to-toe against a muskrat while the rest of you fled for your lives."
With a little help from Matrix.
Elizabeth piped up. The spider puffed out his chest in pride.
"I swung from a rope of his making,"
Monster corrected.
"He did nothing more."
"Humph!" Matrix scoffed, offended. He turned away, head thrown back, and crossed 2 pairs of arms over his chest.
"Not that I'm taking a side, but it sounds to me as if you're overextended,"
Peter mused.
"And don't forget,"
Stu shouted, peering out of his hole again.
"just last week, he screwed up and got left behind for a day."
Peter blushed and threw a nervous grin Monster's way.
"I promise that won't happen again."
Monster grunted.
"Regardless, I will not see you fight or kill."
Who said anything about killing?
Elizabeth's brow furrowed.
I just need to defend myself.
"The two go hand in hand," Monster explained. "If you must fight, if another has threatened you, his life is forfeit."
Elizabeth was silent for a time, her expression quite disturbed.
That's kind of harsh.
Monster nodded.
"War is harsh. Make no mistake, Elizabeth Hartley. When you raise your hand in combat, Even in self-defense, you raise it in war.
Stu stared wide-eyed out of his hole.
Whoa!
Peter agreed. I, for one, would prefer to avoid violence, if possible.
Yours is a good soul,
Monster went on, staring intently at Elizabeth as he tried to convince her of his words.
I would sooner die than see it stained with blood. Look out below!
Stu shouted. The soil around the scale simply crumbled as it came rolling out, taking a screaming Stu with it as it rolled down the side of the hill. Well done, Stu! Peter called after the shrew. But then his grinning smile narrowed. The scale did not appear to be slowing. Frowning, Peter added, Now, if we could just catch up with it. Monster and Elizabeth leapt to their feet to pursue the runaway vehicle. Peter, already standing, was several strides ahead of them, and his longer legs carried him much more quickly. For a time it appeared as if the scale might begin to slow down. Then the grass around it gave way to a well-worn cobblestone path, and with the dirt's resistance gone, the scale began to pick up speed. As Peter stepped out onto the path, he drew to a sudden halt. He glanced down the path after Stu, and then back up the hill from which they had come. Moments later, Elizabeth and Monster drew up behind him.
Stu!
Elizabeth gasped.
Is he...
I think our small friend should be quite all right, Peter mused. This path suggests habitation nearby. Perhaps we've come across a civilization. Monster's brow furrowed.
That may not be a good thing.
With that, he stalked off after the scale and its unwilling passenger. Peter blinked at Monster's back. Civilization? Not a good thing?
He's just a bit jaded.
Elizabeth explained.
Back home, when he was a child, the other children would... Well, I guess you could say they abused him.
Surely there were adults to keep the peace? Elizabeth shook her head.
Surely there were, but for some reason, they didn't. I don't quite understand it myself.
Looking back down the path, she added.
And then, of course, we had our little adventure in the city.
Peter nodded. Yes, I remember. I suppose I can see why that might color one's view of civilization. Elizabeth agreed.
We'd better make sure he doesn't start any fights.
The path led down to a small, mouse-sized brick wall, and through a set of wooden gates. Monster, the first to arrive, stayed back, away from the gates and the crowd of mice gathered there. This did not, however, stop curious locals from gathering in a wide circle around him. When Elizabeth and Peter arrived, they found Monster on the edge of panic as he fingered his halberd, snarling and baring his teeth, despite the mice being unarmed. Pardon us, Peter muttered as he waded through the crowd. The mice quickly parted to make way for the rat, whispering amongst one another of not just the one, but the two strange new arrivals. Many a curious nose sniffed at them in turn, first Monster and then Peter. Did any of you see a vehicle come through here? Peter asked. Several mice pointed through the gates. Peter tipped his cap to them and led Elizabeth and Monster through the crowd. As before, they parted to allow the rat past. The village was circular in shape and had a tendency to slope upwards towards the center. The outlying structures were crude, mostly repurposed objects scavenged from the great ape waste. Towards the center, however, structures of a more professional construction appeared. Ornate carved wooden statues, solidly built dwellings, and a large building with a great many doors loomed over the other, smaller houses. Impressive, Peter remarked as he passed through. Most unusual for common field mice. The scale had left in its wake crowds of disturbed mice, and inside the wall had sped through the town square before coming to a sudden halt when it crashed through the side of a house. Its wheels were still spinning when Elizabeth and her friends arrived.
Is anyone hurt?
Elizabeth shouted. The locals shook their heads at Elizabeth as she passed. No, nobody was harmed. A great many local structures, however, had been variously flipped on their sides and smashed down entirely.
Stu!
Elizabeth called out as she approached the scale.
Stu, are you okay?
A single hand reached over the side of the scale and gave her the thumbs-up gesture. Peter approached the scale and leaned through the opening in the side of the house. "Is there anyone in there?"
Allow me.
Elizabeth spoke up, clambering past him. She lifted Stu over the side of the scale and then squeezed in through the opening. "Help!" a faint voice cried out. Elizabeth gasped as she spotted a small mouse pinned under a fallen rafter.
Hold still. I'm here to help.
The wooden beam was too heavy for Elizabeth to lift. It was not, however, too hard for her to gnaw through, and upon separating the midsection, which lay across the child's leg, Elizabeth was able to remove the heavy chunk of wood.
Peter!
Elizabeth called.
I need your help.
"In a moment, Bess, in a moment." Sunlight burst through the opening as the heavy scale was pulled free, and Peter stepped in. Oh, my word. The heavy weight of the rafter had broken the child's leg on impact, leaving it twisted into an awkward and painful position. "Matrix," Peter snapped his fingers, "I believe I shall need some thread." "Aye, aye," the spider saluted, and proceeded to spin out a long spool of silk. The child let out a yelp of fright at the sight of the creature.
Hush.
Elizabeth whispered, stroking the young mouse's hair.
He's a friend. Don't be afraid.
Peter, meanwhile, gnawed the separated chunk of wood into two small, strong rods. "Matrix, thread!" The spider set the completed spool in Peter's hand, and the rat set about his work. "Now," he warned, "I'm going to need you to be very brave. This may hurt a bit. Understand?" The little mouse nodded, biting his lip. He winced as Peter set his leg and bound it into a crude splint. In short order, Peter emerged from the wrecked house, a very proud spider perched on his shoulder, followed shortly by Elizabeth, who helped support the child's weak side as he limped out. There was a shout, at once joyous and sorrowful. "Eric!" A mouse in a dark, scorched apron, a local blacksmith, rushed out of the crowd and took the child in his arms. As he looked his son up and down, however, his face immediately fell. "Are you—" "He should be quite all right," Peter assured the blacksmith. "Just keep him off his feet for a few weeks, while the bones mend." The mouse looked up at Peter, but rather than gratitude, there was a look of suspicion in his eyes. He stood up and sniffed at Peter before backing away, holding his son close. "Great apes," he whispered. Louder, he shouted to the other mice. "This one has been touched! He has the stench of the great apes upon him!" A shocked murmur swept through the gathered crowd. Peter blinked and then sniffed under his arms. Perhaps I should have bathed at the last stream." Monster fingered his halberd.
I knew it. Every time I've approached a settlement, something like this happens.
The crowd backed away. Mice crawled out of homes and emerged from holes on the street to see what was happening. Along one side of the crowd, there was a great commotion as the mice milled about, shifting and parting.
"Now comes their best fighter,"
Monster growled.
"the cruel one. The one with the chains, or the whip, or spear, or—"
The crowd parted as a truly ancient mouse stepped forward. His brow was heavy and creased, his fur growing sparse, and his skin worn from care and worry. Monster immediately lowered his weapon and stood straighter, a look of intense shock and confusion crossing his face.
"Or a cane?"
He looked down at Elizabeth, as if for an explanation. She shrugged.
Not all mice are out to get you.
Monster furrowed his brow and looked back at the ancient one.
"No, just the vast majority of them."
The old mouse lifted his head and squinted at each of the newcomers in turn. "Who are you? Why have you come?" All her companions immediately looked to Elizabeth. She gulped, forced a friendly expression, and stepped forward.
Well, I'm Elizabeth Hartley. These are my friends.
She indicated each of them in turn.
Peter Dane.
The rat waved. No one waved back.
Stu the shrew.
That's me! That's me!
The shrew hopped about. One or two mice chuckled.
And this is...
Ugh! Ugh! Matrix squeaked, hopping about on Peter's shoulder. Many mice gasped at the mere sight of the little spider. Elizabeth chuckled at the excitable little fellow.
That would be Matrix. Don't worry, he's house-trained.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
And this is Jeremiah Marsh.
Monster gave a low growl at the mention of his real name.
He prefers to be called Monster.
Elizabeth added. Addressing the old mouse, she went on.
As for why we're here, it's kind of an accident. Our scale
At this, she gestured towards the vehicle.
crashed into a hill, and we spent the morning digging it out, and then it got out of control again.
The old mouse grunted. I see,
We don't mean any harm.
Elizabeth insisted.
We didn't even know there was a town here until
She glanced at the wreckage behind her.
that happened.
The old mouse rubbed his chin in thought.
Gustav, bring the boy here.
The blacksmith obeyed, bringing his son forward. The old mouse leaned close, examining Eric's splint.
I am familiar with this technique. Which one of you did this?
That would have been me, Peter answered.
And she helped me free.
Eric added, pointing to Elizabeth. The blacksmith's voice shook as he spoke.
They did this to my son. They must be punished. There will be no punishment, the old mouse answered him. They have righted what they made wrong. Take the boy somewhere to rest. Look at him. He has been crippled.
The old mouse rested a comforting hand on the blacksmith's shoulder.
Only temporarily. He will be well again soon. I promise.
The blacksmith was silent for a moment, rage burning in his eyes. After a time, however, he simply bowed and carried his son away through the crowd. The old mouse turned back to Elizabeth and her companions.
You have my gratitude. This whole matter could have gone far worse.
We're very sorry.
Elizabeth assured him.
If there's anything we can do...
The old mouse gestured for her to be silent.
You have done enough. As my thanks, you and your companions are free to leave in peace.
If I may, Peter spoke up, I'd rather hoped we might remain for a time. You see, we've had a rough...
Silence your rat,
the old mouse growled to Elizabeth.
If you wish to stay, see to it he remains outside the commune. There is a forbidding smell about him, which I do not appreciate.
Again with the smells, Peter mumbled. I say, I shall have to bathe as soon as possible.
I suggest we do leave,
Monster whispered to Elizabeth.
At least long enough for the locals to settle down.
Elizabeth agreed.
Yes, let's.
Looking back to the old mouse, she added,
I am very sorry for the disturbance. I promise it won't happen again.
The old mouse nodded back to her and motioned for the crowd to disperse.
Farewell then, Elizabeth Hartley. Odin guard you to the edge of our lands.
A good many mice did leave, returning to their duties outside the wall. A good many others, however, lingered in small clumps to watch as the newcomers gathered themselves together. The old mouse remained near, patiently watching as Peter fastened a rope around the base of the broken mast, and with Monster's help began hauling it towards the village gate. Elizabeth, for her part, cast a final, sweeping look about the little town.
It's a shame,
she muttered to Stu.
If I didn't know better, I could have sworn I had just come home. All that's missing is a gorge full of centipedes.
Home's where the heart is,
Stu answered.
And I'm not feeling a heart around here.
Elizabeth smiled ruefully.
Wishful thinking, right?
Stu took a long, hard look up at Elizabeth's expression.
You're homesick, ain't you?
Elizabeth nodded.
There are other villages out there, right?
Yeah,
Stu gave his half-hearted assent.
Of course there are. Y'all ain't the only mouse left on Earth.
Elizabeth heaved a sigh and patted the shrew's back.
I know. I don't believe it either. Let's go, Stu.
As they started after the scale, however, there came a shout from one of the higher dwellings.
Wait, don't leave yet.
A lone mouse limped down a stairway from the main building, leaning heavily on a crutch for support. His skin and fur were covered in odd, wavy white markings, punctuated here and there with black dots. As he reached the bottom of the stairway and emerged into the village square, Elizabeth could make out the unusual shape of his legs. The left was normal enough, but the right was unusually short and thin, shriveled and deformed. It swung lifelessly as he moved. The old mouse turned away and met the cripple as he approached.
You shouldn't be here. You should be resting for the feast.
Of course, Matthias.
The cripple bowed his head.
But I heard the commotion and everything from my window.
Yes,
Old Matthias nodded.
and now it's over. Back to bed with you.
With all due respect, sir.
The cripple leaned close and whispered something in Matthias' ear. A look of intense irritation crossed the old mouse's face, but he didn't argue.
Elizabeth Hartley!
Matthias called. Both Monster and Peter drew to a halt and ventured back to see what was happening.
Adam has requested that you stay the night,
the old mouse explained, gesturing to the younger mouse beside him.
I will not deny him.
Elizabeth looked down at Stu for approval, and then to Peter and Monster. Stu and Monster shook their heads, but Peter just shrugged.
I would love to, but I had the impression we weren't welcome.
Adam limped forward on his crutch and looked Elizabeth in the eyes.
If I say you are welcome, then you are welcome, and I say you are welcome.
Elizabeth couldn't help a light blush. She felt her stomach twist in knots it hadn't twisted into since before Edge of the Gorge had fallen. Adam had a very open, sincere face. His eyes were large and kind, a striking light brown framed by the white dye slashed across his face. His smile was weak and pained, but heartfelt. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but strong. As Elizabeth looked upon him, her heart melted. She felt an overwhelming desire to just embrace Adam and take care of him.
Tonight is the harvest feast. It would be my honor if you would sit by my side.
Before she knew what she was doing, Elizabeth felt herself nodding.
I'll have to discuss it with my friends, of course.
Of course,
Adam agreed. Stu stared in dismay at Elizabeth, his mouth agape, as if he were about to protest, yet nothing came out. Monster sighed and shook his head. Peter, at long last, gave an answer in the form of a light nod. Elizabeth coughed and shook her head to clear her mind.
Will Peter be welcome as well? The other mice seemed a bit uncomfortable around him.
As Adam looked at the rat, Elizabeth could see the unease in his face. At long last, he turned back to Elizabeth and nodded.
I'll see what I can arrange.
And his spider matrix?
Elizabeth added. Adam hesitated, blinking.
A spider?
He's very affectionate.
Elizabeth assured Adam.
I've only seen him bite once, and that was while he was protecting me.
Adam looked once more, this time to Peter's shoulder. Matrix met his gaze with the large, begging eyes of a sad, eight-eyed puppy dog. Adam smiled warmly and even managed a soft chuckle.
You know, I think he'll fit right in.
Turning to Matthias, he added,
With your permission, of course.
Matthias nodded reluctantly.
As you desire.
His brow furrowed, however, as he threw a final glance in Peter's direction.
Just be sure you remove that contraption from my village, at once!
Peter nodded to Monster.
That sounds reasonable enough.
Yet as the two pulled the scale through the village gates, Monster growled softly.
This is a mistake.
A free meal, a mistake?
This is not a safe place.
My good man, they are only mice.
Monster glared at Peter as he pulled the scale around the side of the gate.
So am I.
Peter leaned back against the scale and gave Monster a long, thoughtful look.
Do you know what I think?
I really don't care.
I think you are allowing childhood trauma to color your judgment.
Monster threw Peter a quizzical look.
Something bad happened when you were a boy, and now you're judging an unrelated situation by what happened somewhere else entirely." Monster looked away and growled.
I can feel it when they look at us. These mice are a provincial, suspicious lot.
Peter shrugged. "We are outsiders, and we did cause a bit of a stir." Monster shook his head.
I've seen those looks before, always just before something very bad happened.
Peter mused. "If I may, your propensity for violence may have something to do with that. Perhaps if you put down your halberd and tried to appear less menacing, you might have better results with the locals." Monster answered Peter with a cold glare. "There, you see? That's just what I'm talking about."
People fear monsters. They don't attack what they fear. As long as they fear me, I'm safe.
"Well, I can certainly see why you might think that." Peter stepped away from the scale and approached Monster. "But don't you see? As long as you are feared, you will also be shunned. You will be alone, and I think that frightens you. While we have been on the road, you have been a part of this community of sorts. Now, if Elizabeth does manage to join this—" Peter paused and glanced back to the gate. "This commune, I believe they called it, our little crew may start to break up. You'll have to integrate into a society, or go back to living alone." Monster was silent. He stared off into the distance, mulling it all over.
I think you're getting ahead of yourself. We've only been invited to dinner. As far as I know, we'll still leave in the morning.
Peter grinned. Yes, of course. So we have nothing to worry about, correct?" Monster growled back at him. While Peter and Monster argued, Elizabeth found herself in far more pleasant company. Adam had led her up a flight of stairs and through the main entrance of the highest dwelling. His crutch echoed off the hardwood floor as he entered.
"Well, this is it.
Adam announced.
Home."
Elizabeth gasped in awe as she followed Adam through the entryway.
It's beautiful.
Indeed it was. The main chamber was a broad, bowl-shaped space, sloping down to a fire pit that gave off both warmth and light. Its smoke wafted up through a circular hole in the ceiling, through which sunlight filtered in during the day and starlight shone down by night. A spacious passage circled around the rim of the chamber, fenced off by a light wooden screen and beautifully carved pillars.
"And that's just the parlor,"
Adam added. Stu visibly paled as he laid eyes on his new surroundings.
Shoot, and here I thought my mansion was something.
And you live here alone?
Elizabeth asked. Adam shrugged.
"Well, yes and no. My family lives here, but we don't talk much. I'm mostly just a benefactor."
So, like a wife and kids?
Stu asked. Adam shook his head.
"If only. I'm not exactly... well, I'm not really much of a catch."
Elizabeth nearly laughed.
Not a catch? Nonsense. You're obviously quite rich, and you...
She paused. Elizabeth was about to say, "You've been nothing but kind and generous," yet she realized she had only known the strange mouse for a few minutes.
It's strange. I feel as if I've known you all my life. But that's silly, isn't it?
"Maybe we'll met in a previous life."
Adam suggested.
"You don't believe in reincarnation, do you?"
I sincerely hope not.
Elizabeth giggled.
One life is about all I can take.
Adam's expression shifted. Some of the spirit appeared to go out of him, and he leaned more heavily on his crutch.
"Well, I do. I like to think I've already met everyone, and that one day I'll see them again with a healthier, stronger body, so I can finally share my life with them."
Elizabeth felt her heart sink as Adam spoke.
You say that like you're already dead.
Adam looked away, and he forced a laugh.
"Right. I guess I'm a bit of a fatalist. You tend to get that way when..."
His voice trailed off. Looking back at Elizabeth, Adam's face suddenly brightened again.
"Well, may I show you to your room?"
Elizabeth nodded. Adam led her round to the right, passing behind the screen and down the passage until he came to a solid wooden door. It opened into a cozy little room overlooking the rest of the commune. The ceiling sloped down to the floor, as if it were a fragment of a globe set on top of the foundation. Several small holes let the sun stream in, or allowed the room's occupants to look out. A soft, feathery bed stood against the inner wall, and just beyond that stood a beautifully carved wardrobe. Elizabeth's eyes grew wide as she entered.
I've never seen anything like it.
She paused a moment, and then added,
Back home, we always just used pieces of grade 8 pottery or discarded containers.
Adam beamed.
I'm glad you approve. The, wardrobe is a bit sparse. Just a few spare cloaks for now. My sister is a seamstress. I could have her send up some clothes.
Stu hopped onto the bed and leaned back with a rapid-fire crack, crack, crack of his spine as he stretched out.
Real nice, Lisbeth. I could get used to this.
Oh, thank you, but no.
Elizabeth answered.
I'm a simple woman. All I need is a fresh cloak for warmth.
Are you sure? My sister's quite good, and I expect you would dress up very nicely.
Elizabeth cracked a smile and shook her head.
I appreciate the offer, but no. I prefer to stay light on my feet. Besides, we're just spending one night.
Adam paused in thought.
You must lead a hard life.
Elizabeth grinned.
Is it that obvious?
A sad look crept into Adam's eyes as he nodded.
I'm afraid so.
For just a moment, his chin quivered.
I won't claim to know or understand what happened to you, but I am sorry for it, whatever it was.
He looked down at himself as he felt his strong legs start to shake.
Please excuse me, I need to rest.
I understand.
Before leaving, Adam stopped, removing a ring from his finger, and offered it to Elizabeth.
Please take this, it's my seal. If anyone gives you trouble, just show it to them. They'll understand.
Elizabeth accepted with a raised eyebrow.
Are the locals often difficult?
Adam shook his head.
We're not accustomed to outsiders. This should make it easier for them to accept you.
Adam's crutch tapped against the floor as he limped out the door.
I'll see you at the feast then.
Tonight.
Elizabeth agreed with a gentle wave. The last she saw of Adam's face was a warm smile as he closed the door behind him. Then he faded away in a series of unsteady footsteps and taps of crutch against wood. In Adam's absence, Elizabeth gave the ring a careful looking over. It, like the rest of the town, appeared to be carved from wood, its surface inscribed with various foreign runes. In place of a stone or gem, there was mounted an engraving of a strange reptilian figure, a dragon perhaps. After a time, Elizabeth slipped the ring onto her finger. Next, she tested the doorknob. It turned easily enough.
Not locked.
Y'all was expecting different?
Elizabeth turned around and leaned against the door with a smirk.
This all just seemed to be too good to be true.
She paused to chuckle.
For a moment, I expected to find out I'd walked into a trap.
She heaved a mirthful sigh and rubbed her forehead.
I feel so silly.
Well, y'all never know. Maybe this is some kind of Children of the Corn deal.
Elizabeth laughed aloud at the suggestion. Stu grinned.
Or maybe we're in a ghost town, and they're all ghosts.
Elizabeth held her stomach, laughing all the harder.
Oh wait, I got it. They're all aliens, and this is some kind of crazy experiment.
By now, Elizabeth had to sit down at the foot of the bed.
Or maybe we're both crazy, and none of this exists, and we're just sitting on a beach somewhere imagining it all.
Elizabeth stopped laughing, a pensive look crossing her face.
Or maybe I'm really just back home, in bed, dreaming it all. In a moment, I'll wake up. I'll be a teacher again. And Don will be waiting to sweep me off somewhere romantic once class lets out.
Ooh, I hope not, Stu cringed. I'd hate to disappear after all this time.
An amused smile crossed Elizabeth's face, and she hopped to her feet.
Well, the day is still young. I think I'll have a look around. Maybe I can accustom the locals to my face.
Stu sat up,
Well, wait for me then. I'm coming, Elizabeth.
The shrew hopped down from the bed and followed at Elizabeth's heels as she left.